Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It is such a pleasure to have Jennifer Egan and Michelle Zahner here to discuss what is one of my favorite books, Jennifer Egan's beloved best-selling novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, on the occasion of its 10th anniversary. When it was first published in 2010, A Visit from the Goon Squad was hailed by Time magazine as a new classic of American fiction and won that year's Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, becoming a major national bestseller. More recently, earlier this year, Entertainment Weekly named it the best book of the decade. This stunningly original novel follows Benny, an aging former punk rocker and record exec, and Sasha, a passionate and troubled young woman he employs, revealing their past along with the inner lives of a host of other characters whose paths intersect with theirs. A Visit from the Goon Squad is an exhilarating novel of music, self-destruction, and redemption. Jennifer Egan is the author of several novels and a short story collection. Her most recent novel, Manhattan Beach, a New York Times bestseller, was awarded the 2018 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. Also a journalist, she's written frequently for the New York Times Magazine, and she is president of PEN America. Michelle Zahner is a writer and musician, performing music under the moniker Japanese Breakfast. She spent the last several years touring the world, following the release of her two critically acclaimed albums, Psychopomp and Soft Sounds from Another Planet. Both of her records focus heavily on the death of her mother and her grieving process. In 2016, Michelle won Glamour Magazine's Essay of the Year for Love, Loss, and Kimchi. And in 2018, her essay, Crying in H Mart, was published in The New Yorker. Knopf will publish her memoir under the same title in 2021. Just to give you a sense of how this event is going to proceed, over the course of the next hour, Jenny and Michelle are going to discuss literature, art, music, and much more. Jenny will start off by talking a little bit about the origins of Goon Squad, and then they will have a conversation together. At 7:40, we'll open up the Q&A portion. As you've already heard, please send us your questions by email. The email address is posted in the chat, and we will get to them towards the end of the event. So Jenny and Michelle, thank you so much again for being here tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lexi and Michelle and everyone. It's really fun to see from how many different parts of the country and even the world people are joining us from. So that's really a great advantage to Zooming. Obviously, we all know there are disadvantages, but it's really nice to see. So thank you. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about the genesis of Goon Squad, because there really was sort of an incident that sparked the book, which in a way was a giant procrastination against beginning the next book that I knew I was going to write, which was this historical novel that I could sense would be a lot of work. So while I was putting that off, I had dinner with my mother in a hotel in New York. And while I was using the ladies' room, I looked down and I saw a woman's bag with a wallet in it sitting right under the sink. And I immediately thought, that's nuts. I mean, someone's going to take the wallet. And in that moment, I think one reason I felt so concerned on behalf of the wallet owner is that I myself have been robbed a ridiculous number of times. It's got to be 10 or more. And so my mind immediately, I think, connected to the most memorable of those robberies, which occurred many years ago. I like to think I'm so much more mature now. But in any case, my whole purse was stolen, and I was really flipping out because I was supposed to catch a plane later that day, and I had no money, no cash card, and I was actually having sort of a panic attack about it. And in the middle of this, my phone rang, and it turned out that it was the Citibank fraud recovery program. This very nice woman. I wept. I told her I was so upset. We went through everything that had been in my wallet, and she said, we can replace it right away. It was time to pick a new cash card, which I desperately needed, of course, to get to the airport. And I had to pick a new PIN number. And she said, no, it can't be the same as the old one. And I said, no, it wasn't. And I explained the difference. And then the call ended kind of quickly because it turned out I was actually talking to the thief. And she had done an absolutely brilliant impersonation of a bank employee, right down to the clicking keyboard in the background. Now I had stupidly given her my PIN number, and she already had my cash card. So she rushed to the nearest bank and overdrew my account, which I didn't even know you could do. So when all of this came to light, which happened maybe a couple of hours later. I mean, I was upset before. You can imagine the state I was in at that point. And, you know, it was one of those problems that isn't a real problem. I did somehow get to the airport. I was reimbursed by the bank. You know, it was not a real disaster. But I found myself kind of preoccupied with the woman herself, because we had been on the phone together for maybe 10 minutes. And I kept thinking, what was it like from her side? You know, what was she thinking? Now, of course, it's probably easy to answer that. She was thinking, whoa, I've got a live one here. I think it's going to work. But I kept wondering about her point of view. And that's sort of the key to my writing process. It's driven by curiosity and interest in lives that not only are not like mine, but most fascinatingly opposed to mine in some way. So in that case, the point of view of the thief. So I think seeing that wallet, realizing that in fact I could take the wallet if I wanted to, because the wallet owner was nowhere in sight, made me reconnect with that curiosity. And so I decided the next day, instead of, you know, slogging away at my research, I was going to just write from that moment. A woman sees another woman's wallet and she takes it. So I did that, and I wrote what became the first chapter, but I had absolutely no sense that I was working on a book. But in the course of writing that, there was a brief mention of this woman's boss. I didn't even name him at that point, because it was a note in passing about a guy who sprays pesticide in his armpits and puts gold flakes in his coffee. And at the time I was thinking, aha, you know, these crazy record producers and their wacky habits. But of course, never really having known one. But I found myself thinking, but why does he do those things? He must have a reason. So I wrote another short story from his point of view. And in the course of writing that, I got kind of curious about his ex-wife. So I wrote one more. And it was really only at that point that I suddenly realized, I think I just want to work on this stuff. And so in a way, the most decisive things about the book had already been determined almost accidentally, that each chapter would be about a different person. Each chapter would stand completely on its own. And probably most importantly, each chapter would feel like it was part of a different book from the others, that I would use different technical approaches to the material. And so I just kept doing that. And I had plenty of failures. You know, the epic poetry chapter did not go well. And there were many others along the way that I tried to animate and just couldn't. But this is kind of what I ended up with. And so that is the kind of happenstantial way that it came to be.
Well, thank goodness for, for its genesis. I have to say, as a musician, the way that this book came into my life was so fitting. I was on tour in Norway, and the musician Lucy Dacus was recommending books to me, and this was one of them. And I finally read it in February. And I actually feel like a apt title for this event would be like, why haven't I reread this? Because I feel like this is such a great book to reread, because I just did a poor read the first time around, but I realized the interconnectedness of all of the characters. There were so many like small things that I didn't notice beforehand, like that Lulu is dating like the great grandson of in the Africa chapter, and just paying close attention to that was really thrilling to reread, not so far from my first read. So I was just curious, like, as you were writing all of this, how did you keep, because it spans like so many different cities around the world and so many different parts of different characters' lives, how did you keep track of all of the characters and just what we didn't get to see? Like, did you have like a large graph or PowerPoint of all these characters and their like entire lives mapped out so you could like sort of double check that you were in line with what you had written?
You know, not exactly. I mean, well, first of all, I didn't even know what PowerPoint was when I was working on this book. That was a late add-on, and I can tell that story later if you want. But I sold the book without that. I had been trying to work with PowerPoint unsuccessfully. I think, you know, because I was really just following my own curiosity, I didn't worry too much about the grid, sort of how everything fit together. I just, and often I had to tweak ages later. Like there came a point where I had to really say, okay, what year is this? How old are all of the people? But for the most part, I didn't really do that as I was working. I just kind of followed the heat, if you will, of what seemed fun to work on. And then some of those connections I made later. Like I would find ways that were connected that maybe I hadn't known right away. But I would say more often it was the way I described initially, where a little detail about someone would interest me and I would just go with that. So another example is, Benny Salazar, Sasha's boss, we learn in the chapter from his point of view that he had this kind of punk rock past. It just comes and goes. It's mentioned in passing. But as soon as I wrote that, I found myself thinking, because I'd been hoping I could use the material of my own teenage years, which really was when punk rock first happened. I'm that old. In San Francisco, where I was kind of a bystander. I was certainly not, deeply involved, but I witnessed a moment that was kind of exciting and extreme in certain ways. And I had hoped to find some way to use that. And somehow Benny's mention of that immediately made me think, okay, let's go there. Let's just see that moment with him and his friends. And I said it really at my high school, which is Lowell High School, a big public high school in San Francisco. And so that was often how it went. There was another moment in that story when the narrator, Rhea, who is part of the group that Benny's friends with as a teenager, sees a photograph of her friend Jocelyn's extremely inappropriate, middle-aged boyfriend on a trip to Africa with his family. And I suddenly thought, okay, yeah, so they're seeing him as this lechy old guy, but he also has a family. Like he has another kind of life in which he plays a very different role. Let's see that. And I had been on a safari to Africa at 18 with my family. It was actually the first time I'd really ever left the country. So it was an amazing experience. And I had kept a very detailed journal. And in fact, had tried to use that material at an earlier point unsuccessfully. And I mean like 15 years earlier. So I just returned to that. So curiosity really was my guide. I didn't have high hopes for this book, I should say. I thought, well, it'll be kind of a placeholder while I finally tackle this gigantic historical novel. If I can just sort of, hang in there with this and it'll be hopefully kind of fun, then I'll get serious with the next one. So I had a lot of fun doing it. And that's a nice memory, actually. It was a very kind of rich writing process driven by curiosity and fun.
It's funny when, as you were talking about this, I remember reading an interview where you mentioned two main sources of inspiration for this novel were In Search of Lost Time and The Sopranos. And I remember thinking, am I correct?
Sure.
And I remember being very confused by it, the mention of The Sopranos, and now it makes quite a bit of sense to me, just thinking about, rereading it, and Lou is such a despicable character. And then you really get to see some other sides of him, or there are so many different parts of all of these characters where they can be quite despicable in certain points in their life, and then this other side of them is revealed. Do you feel like that was part of the influence of that? I feel like, with The Sopranos, like you have this mob boss who's killed people, and yet everyone relates to Tony Soprano so much. Was that some of the inspiration there?
I love The Sopranos, and I found myself asking myself, why does this have so much power? And I think what the influence came not so much from sort of character modeling as from my questioning what made serialized television so fun, or really serialized storytelling, because it started in the 19th century with fiction. And that 19th century fiction offers really all of the same pleasures that we now look to serialized TV for, which are basically multiple stories kind of laterally unfolding, characters moving in and out of focus, often a lot of time passing, and just a lot of flexibility in storytelling. So I think I was sort of interested in using some of those techniques, and I was hoping that I would find a way to do it. But I hadn't figured out how or when. And I generally have a sort of list like this in my head of sort of things I'm hoping I find a time to do or use. During the same years that I was watching The Sopranos, in my book club, if you can believe it, we were reading In Search of Lost Time, which I'd only gotten through like the first couple of volumes of when I was reading in my 20s, when I felt like, why would anyone care about time? It's such a boring topic. In my book club, it took us 6 years.
Oh my
Can you
God.
imagine reading one book for 6 years? We gave birth to a number of children in that time. So we had a kind of Proustian experience as we were reading Proust. But I found myself thinking in that context, you know, time is the essential ingredient of all fiction. In a certain sense, any work of fiction is a story of time passing, even if it's just a minute. And yet there are certain works of fiction, and In Search of Lost Time is probably the best known, although I would also say James Salter's Light Years, certain works of fiction in which time is actually the subject. The passage of time is the explicit focus of the book. And I thought, how could you write a contemporary book that's about time passing without doing it in the real time way that Proust did, in which actually a lot of your own life passes, although hopefully not 6 years, in the course of reading it. So I think that was another question on my list of kind of creative inquiries or goals. And somehow, once I realized I was working on a book with these 3 stories, and I happened to have written them in a backwards chronology. So immediately time was kind of foregrounded as a concern of the project. I thought, maybe this is the book about time. And almost inevitably, because I was writing it in these different pieces from different points of view, the serialized television inquiry leapt to the foreground as well, because it was something I was going to do piecemeal, in which the overarching story would kind of only become clear at the end of the season, if you will.
You mentioned that it was a very natural sort of curiosity that led you to explore different characters. Did that ever fail you? Did you try to tackle a specific character and a chapter that just didn't work out, that got cut?
Yes, I most certainly did. I think my biggest failure was I really wanted to write about Rolf, Lou's son, who we know commits suicide. I wanted to write about him in his adult life. And so I had a whole notion of what would have happened to him. And this actually relates to a question you asked earlier, which is whether I sort of had these whole stories already in mind. Mostly no. Pretty much what I knew ended up on the page, but because my writing process is so much about discovery, that if I don't get anywhere with something, then it's sort of like I never really find out what happened. But I struggled with Rolf, and I wanted to write it in the form of a play, sort of in kind of using the conventions of drama on the page, let's say. And I thought, well, that's a great idea, because that'll be different from all the other chapters. I mean, it was one of those things that conceptually made sense, but I just could not make it work. It was not good. And then I struggled enormously too with the job. This one I finally mastered, or at least completed. But I really wanted to show Sasha in college, and I couldn't sort of Sasha as a woman in her 20s, a young woman, I couldn't figure out how to get near her. I had her traveling in the Far East in one story. It was, and then I finally got there with Out of Body, but there was a lot, as I went on, and I had fewer options, because once I had told the story, you know, I was somewhat constrained in what could happen, because things had already happened. And because my process kind of requires this open-ended sense of infinite possibility and discovery, I think I began to feel a little hemmed in. So it got harder as I went on. And Out of Body was a really hard one. Pete,
that's one of my favorites. So
thank you. God, I
feels like the centerpiece of the novel. Anyway.
It feels a little marred by the its creation, but in that it was so hard. But I at least I arrived at something I could put in the book.
That's comforting to know that like something can be challenging and looked. I mean, have you reread any of your books? Is that an experience that people have?
I do not, and I haven't reread Goon Squad. The first chapter I know really well because that's often the one I've ended up reading aloud. I mean, I know the whole thing well. I'm actually working now on a sort of companion volume to it, so which I hope to finish actually in a couple of months. So it's been on my mind a lot, actually. It's nice to have this conversation. I purposely haven't actually sat down and reread it because sometimes books, even I think to the writer, him or her, to the writer themselves, it can have a kind of weirdly iconic, scary quality once it exists as a book, and it feels like you can never match it. So I don't want to get intimidated and use Goon Squad as a way of making me feel like this new one, doesn't have legs. But I do think about it a lot because I'm trying to, create a book that's related to it and has some similarities of approach, and yet it has a totally different set of interests and also different characters. So I'm kind of more focused on the next generation, although Lou reappears rather strongly. So
yeah, he weirdly became one of my favorite characters, I think, on this reread. I had a couple of questions about craft. As someone who's just finished their first book, my first thought is like, okay, I'm definitely going to take this knowledge for the next one. And I wish I had been smarter. I had known this before I had started this. This was your fourth novel, and I'm curious what you felt like you took from what you felt like you learned from each of your novels that you brought into this book, and also maybe what you learned writing this book and what you brought to your next novel and most recent novel.
I often find I have exactly the feeling as I'm working that you just described, like, wow, I've really learned a lot here. I'm going to be in much better shape for the next one. Funnily enough, I feel like often what I've done in the last book is not only not good preparation for the next, because my books are so different from each other, but actually profoundly unhelpful and potentially ruinous. But this may be different for you. I mean, this has a lot to do with the fact that I seem to always want to work against what I've done. In any case, there's a kind of renunciation phase that always has to happen. So for example, when I was working on the historical novel, Manhattan Beach, that I published a couple of years ago, I thought I would bring all kinds of tricky approaches to time with me to work on that book, because I thought, well, I've just written a whole book about time. I'm an expert on that. And so I had, for a while, a narrator who would kind of intervene and remind the reader that it's not actually 1942, that, 9/11 and other events like that have happened. And it was so unhelpful. I mean, people hated it when that narrator did that. So I had to kind of let all of that go. And the story that I was telling seemed to require a much more traditional storytelling manner and not fragmentation and irony and some of the things that helped me here. But that being said, of course, I'm sure there are lessons I take with me. And I think one of the biggest is actually that, that each book feels like it's not going to work at a certain point, and it really feels that way. Like I feel really lost in a fog. And I try to remember that I know I've felt that way before, and that each book sort of has that phase. And so that is actually a super helpful lesson, actually. I think that's probably the biggest one. And that, letting go of everything I've done, doesn't mean that I can't do something else. On the contrary, using different techniques will let me tell a different kind of story.
Do you recall, when writing this book, there being something that was really quite difficult for you to let go of, that you really liked writing but didn't quite fit into the story? That would be too particular.
You know, I think the things that mattered most to me, I ultimately found ways to use. The big exception would probably be Rolf. But, you know, I finally did have to let him go. And it's funny because I don't give up easily. Even when I approached the material again in this new book, I thought, I wonder if I can find a way to do what I had hoped to do with Rolf. No, that train has left the station.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. But there were, you know, I mentioned already that I wanted to get a look at Sasha. I sort of wanted to write about kind of the early 90s, that moment musically, Sasha in college. And I tried so many things before I found something that worked. And the other one was I really wanted to write about pauses in songs.
Yeah.
And that was just another one of those kind of wish list things. And I had a very long, unsuccessful chapter that involved an academic who would occasionally deliver long speeches about how pauses functioned in songs. And of course, it was deadly boring. I mean, I didn't even want to listen to this. And I thought, you know, how can I find a way to earn that possibility of someone explaining how pauses function in songs? But I find sometimes, this is actually another craft thing that I have learned. Okay, this is another lesson. I think that generally a really good solution solves more than one problem. If you find the right move, it should do more than just one thing. So when I finally, when I finished the book and sold it, one of the things that was wrong about it that anyone could see, and I discussed this with my editor, who's your editor,
Yeah.
Jordan Pavlik, and she agreed with me that it was unfortunate. If you picture the book without the PowerPoint chapter, it starts to feel like it's really more a book about Benny, because we see him in his future life in the last chapter, but we don't ever see Sasha. But I couldn't find a way to get to her. It was another one of those problems. I also really wanted to use PowerPoint in the book, but that is not something anyone else was missing, obviously. But when I finally found a way to use PowerPoint, which more than anything depended on imagining using PowerPoint to depict the desert, because I'm very place driven in my work. And so somehow I have to feel where something is happening in order for it to really work. Once I sort of felt like PowerPoint and the desert were possibly going to yield fiction that would be workable, and I realized that Sasha's daughter was narrating the PowerPoint. Okay, now I've solved two problems that were really nagging at me. I've got PowerPoint in there, and I've found a way to write about Sasha in the future. And finally, I also found that PowerPoint was the realm in which I could bring in these pauses and talk about and find, you know, PowerPoint is all about demonstration. I mean, that's literally what it is as a corporate form. So it lent itself to some of this pause analysis in a way that you know, more conventional fiction did not. So that was a solution that actually solved three problems. And it even did something else that I hadn't even realized until later, which is that it created a pause in the book at exactly the same moment that most pauses occur in songs, or at least the most successful ones, according to
penultimate moment. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's really a testament to the organic nature of the process. As my friend Sarah Z says, the work makes the work. And her work is about as amazing as it could possibly be. But you know, there is a kind of organic wholeness, I think, to any artistic work. And our job, as much as anything, is to kind of feel our way toward that intuitively.
I had just one last question about craft, which was what your revision process was like, especially when I actually was with Robin Desser originally before she moved to Random House, and when I was speaking with Jordan for the first time and having read your book and they're there, my first question to her was like, what was the revision process like for A Visit from Goon Squad? And what was your, like, did you have a role in the PowerPoint? Like, I was curious, like, what was your revision process like? What parts of the story were formed? And I think she mentioned that the PowerPoint wasn't there before in the first draft.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because my process is very particular and fairly blind. So I write fiction. My first drafts in fiction are always by hand, because I want to get into sort of a meditative state, and I really don't want to see what I'm writing as I write it. And my handwriting is so terrible that it really enables that blindness. So I write in a kind of hurtling fashion in which ideally I get one step ahead of my conscious mind and am surprised by what happens on the page. I only read over what I wrote the day before, and then I continue from there by hand until I have a draft. So in Goon Squad, I was writing in shorter pieces, so this was not so unwieldy. But to give you an idea of what a wacko process this is, with Manhattan Beach, that meant 26 legal pads full of handwriting.
Oh my God.
That I had to type up, basically 1,000 pages, and then read through and try to make sense of. And of course, a lot of it is just nonsense. In Goon Squad, I worked on it in shorter pieces, which means that I would, write that draft by hand, type it up, and then continue to revise until I reached a stopping point. But in the case of many of those chapters, that had to have been 25, 30 drafts at least. And because I edit by hand on hard copies and number my drafts, I actually can keep how many drafts I've done. That sounds like a lot, but if you think about editing on a screen, think about how many times your eyes run over a page and how many little edits you make. If you were numbering each one of those iterations, it would add up quickly. So I do a lot of drafts. Then I have a writing group, I should have mentioned that, whom I meet with fairly regularly and often read the material that's really raw just to find out if it's alive. We only read aloud, so we're thinking a lot about the sound, the rhythm of the language. So that's a part of my process. And then I have many readers whom I rely on to give me feedback once I have a whole draft. All of that happens before a professional editor even sees the book. So in the case of Goon Squad, I turned in a book that was very much as it is now, except without the PowerPoint, because I hadn't found a way to do that. Because, again, there's so much blindness and feeling my way that I have to get outside perspectives, or I can really go very wrong, as I was doing in Manhattan Beach, using that kind of ironic, all-knowing narrator who was in fact driving people nuts. I learned that from my writing group. So I was very grateful to kind of rid myself of that irritant before I really got too invested in that way of telling the story.
Wow. Do we have time for, should we turn to the Q&A, or do we have time for?
Yes. Sorry, got muted there and couldn't unmute myself, but I'm back. So we have a lot of questions that have come in over chat and email. So let me find, let's see. Let's start with this one from Catherine. It says, this is for Jenny, if you were to revisit or rewrite the last chapter, how would you write it differently in light of the world or country's current situation?
What a great question. I would have to change it a lot, because a lot of what I have there that seemed kind of fun and exciting at the time is just banal and basically reads as verisimilitude now. When I was writing that, the iPhone hadn't come out. So the idea of children playing with touchscreens seemed hilarious. I think we can all agree it is now a common sight. and one that we probably wish were less common. So all of that is just, you know, is not exciting or futuristic. I mean, of course, the year that I was writing about, the future, was like now. So it's very funny to have this conversation 10 years later, because basically in terms of the ages of the characters, and I never really nailed down the year that each chapter takes place, but I know it's about 2021 is what I was imagining. So that's not interesting. And I'm now writing into the future again, as I have to do to follow some of these characters into their futures. And so I'm having to think forward. The other thing that hadn't happened was Hurricane Sandy. And in fact, the idea of building a wall around Lower Manhattan is actually a possibility. So again, that's not exciting or funny or anything. It's just sort of old. So all of that would have to change. But, you know, it wouldn't be the future anymore because it would be the present. So, you know, it's a very strange thing. It's funny how far away the future seems, even 10 years, and how quickly it arrives. And I will also say, you know, I was not enamored of the idea of writing into the future at all, because it's a fool's errand. You're gonna be superseded and prove to be either wrong or trite. So I thought, oh, I don't want to go into the future, but I really wanted to write about Alex, the guy that Sasha has the one night stand with in the first chapter, in his future. So there was a brief period when I toyed with moving the entire timeline of the book backwards so that Alex could be the age he is in the last chapter in 2009, which is when I finished the book. But the problem with that is that it didn't work musically. Suddenly, I'm not in the punk rock moment anymore. I'm dealing with, you know, Elvis or something. I mean, music outside of my lifetime that I don't have any feeling for. So I really had no choice and sort of, you know, reluctantly had to imagine forward. And I have no regrets, but it just doesn't read as futuristic anymore. And it's not.
I can still see the blind parrots becoming a thing.
I bet more of that goes on than we realize.
I totally believe it.
Okay, I have a question from Angela. Did considering pauses in music influence your use of silences and dialogue? She says, as I'm reading Goon Squad a second time, I'm more conscious of pauses and hushes and appreciate more.
That's a great question too. I think that it was the other way around. I think I was already pretty preoccupied with pauses and how they function. And as I mentioned, you know, in our writing group, we only read aloud. I mean, that means, you know, someone can, I mean, usually me, will sit down and actually read for an hour. And that's arduous for all of us. But the reason we do it is that I'm kind of experiencing the rhythm of the language is just, it's an essential dimension of fiction that one really has to utilize if the fiction is going to be harnessing all of its tools and work the best that it can. So silence is an essential part of rhythm. And so I think I was already sort of preoccupied in that way. And as I mentioned, you know, the PowerPoint was a late add-on. The explicit discussion of pauses was very late. But in rereading the book, as one has to do a number of times through copy editing and page proofs and all of that, what was sort of shocking was how much attention I had already been drawing to pauses. So I think it grew organically out of that.
Sorry about that. Okay, so there's a sort of two-part question from Tiffany. The first one's for Jenny. It says, have you written or composed music before? And so we'll start there.
I have not. And I'm not very musical. I actually don't play an instrument and I can't read music, which I feel very regretful about. I have two kids who are pretty musical, one in particular, and I just see what a joy and a delight it is in his life and how much joy it brings to others. So no, not only do I not, but it's kind of a regret. And even as you said that, I thought maybe I could learn, maybe I could use that in fiction somehow, which shows you that, you know, the minute I come upon any form, I will entertain the idea of somehow learning it so that I can use it in fiction. But I think it's too late for me musically, sadly.
The second part of the question, and this is for Michelle, is what are the similarities or differences in your approach from writing essays or writing nonfiction to writing songs and compositions?
Oh, I mean, I think that I am interested in like I have the same preoccupations in terms of theme and topic when it comes to writing nonfiction and music. But having written my first book, it was so wretchedly hard, I realized, to just not have anything to hide behind, and also not have anything. So I guess like what Jenny's saying about trying on different forms, like one thing that was so hard for me about writing this book was not getting to like pick up a bass if like the guitar is not working, or like a keyboard if another instrument's not working. It's just you and like the page, and if it's bad, it's very clearly bad, and there's like nothing to hide behind. So I think that was a major challenge for me, and a big difference is that it's so many more words. First of all, a song is like, I feel like maybe 50 words, and they're you know, anyone or most people can, you know, feel like they could write something, whereas like there is more language that you can kind of hide behind with music, because not everyone feels like it's something they can do. There's more kind of mystery to it.
Okay, sorry, there's a bunch of questions coming in. This is a good one from Ramon. It says, how did you know, this is for Jenny, or tell that you were finished in terms of the characters and their points of view? Who was the narrator of the mentioned epic poem chapter that did not work?
You know, it never really felt quite finished, and I think that the proof of that is that I've been curious enough to continue with some of these people. I mean, it's sort of the very nature of the book that there is no finished exactly. I mean, it could sort of go on forever theoretically, but not really, because it has to be good. It has to be telling its own story. So I kind of, it was more that I just felt like I had done everything I could do, and I felt good about where it started and where it ended. That was really important. And actually, there was a period where I really hated the chapter that became the last chapter, because I kept thinking, I had the idea that the book would go backwards chronologically. That was actually something that I had wrong as I was working on it. Therefore, that last chapter should come first, according to that chronology. And I kept thinking, ugh, it's going to be bad. It's not a good way to start. We don't know who any of these people are. So it was actually a huge relief when I realized that it worked as a last chapter. And so that feeling that I had a beginning and I had an end sort of, in a way, kind of girded me as I felt my way through curiously. But it really was more that I just felt like I had done what I could do. And obviously that wasn't true, because that PowerPoint hadn't happened yet. But I was able to write that pretty quickly once I figured out what I was going to do. And I think I knew there was just no more to be had at that point. In terms of who was narrating the epic poetry chapter, it's telling that I kind of don't remember. I feel like it was someone that we don't end up. There was one person there were certain things I knew would happen, and actually I'm getting at some of those in the next book. And there's one person that we actually still don't hear from, even in the new book. But I think I kept bringing her in to fill various roles, none of which she did successfully. She was the academic. Pardon? Was it Alice? No, it was not Alice. Although I'm curious about her, but I think she's too far removed. No, it was actually Ted's second wife, whom we don't even get to here. But anyway, she was the academic that I thought would talk about pauses, and I tried to kind of, I think she may have been the epic poetry narrator, but she remains opaque to this day.
Here's another good one. This is a question from Matt. It says, often when I'm thinking about Goon Squad, I also remember the metropolitan characters of Emerald City, and even Look at Me, which obviously had a more defined plot line. Though you mentioned your approach to the work shifting with each new project, do you ever feel these characters and stories existing in the same universe, even as strangers?
That's such an interesting question. I think now that I am, for the first time, actually writing, someone's asking for, I'm going to admit someone to the waiting room. Anyway, now that I actually am writing about characters connected to Goon Squad, I feel a little bit a sense of open season on that front. In other words, like, why couldn't they connect to other books? But the only one I can really imagine it happening with it, honestly, is Look at Me. There are real echoes somehow of Look at Me, at least for me, in the new book. And I may try to connect them. It would be a very small connection. It would just be like a little bit kind of like a wink to someone who had read the book, because I can't really imagine conjoining those worlds in a forceful way. But, you know, Look at Me is sort of futuristic. It's never quite clear when it's taking place. And it is very appealing to actually link to some of that material. It's a little like seeing little islands and then realizing that one landmass connects them. It's very satisfying when it happens.
You have really fascinated people by the handwriting detail that you shared about how you write. And so there's a couple questions on that, but Barbara says, your process of handwriting your first draft is so interesting. Do you think if you typed it on a computer, you would get too caught up in revising?
I think that's exactly what would happen. I mean, when I write an article, when I do journalism, I always write on a computer, because that's a process of synthesizing a gigantic amount of material that I already have acquired, or a knowledge, or a sort of brief expertise. So it's really a project of condensation. But with fiction, when I'm writing a first draft, it's a process of discovery. I don't actually know what's going to happen. So I have to get into a state of mind that will let me just be surprised. And somehow that can't happen looking at a screen. I wish it could, because it would be faster, because this is a very slow process, but it doesn't really seem to work. I should mention one more thing that I neglected to say about my writing process. Once I have that first draft, then I create very detailed outlines. So it's not that I never have a plan. Once I have the first draft, I have very, very detailed plans. And since we were just talking about Look at Me, I'll mention that my first revision outline for Look at Me was, I think, 70 pages long in 10-point type, single spaced. So the outlines can be extremely complex and detailed. And one reason is that when I go back into the revision mode, I'm sort of back to the unthinking writing state of mind. And so I don't always remember all the plans and the things I wanted to do. I need to have those lists near me. And with each major draft, I create a new outline that's hopefully a bit shorter than the last one. So there's a lot of analysis and sort of systematic planning. It's just that I have to pick the right moments to do it.
Sort of to that point, so there's a question from Belinda who wanted to know, it was about your conceptualization for the chapter that takes place in the future, but she wanted to know about the specific details, the science fiction details, and wondered if you had more that sort of didn't make it in about geography, architecture, and technology.
That's a good question. And it's interesting. I'm now having to a little bit stretch my memory, because we're back to like 2008, or no, actually 2000, it was before the iPhone. So it would have been like 2007 when I was writing that. I feel like I got most of it. I don't think there was anything, I mean, I will say this, you know, I don't consider myself a science fiction writer, because it's not like I sort of have a concept that seems really cool and develop it. It's more that as I'm really driven by the characters and sort of trying to follow them into some sort of future, and certain things kind of come to me, but it's not like I had a whole plan that I wanted to unleash on the reader. There's a lot of technology in this new book that I'm working on. There's just no way to write forward without dealing with technology. And so I guess in a way I'm kind of doing that again. But I think a real sci-fi writer would probably say, this does not qualify. There's not enough kind of interesting technology here to really earn that moniker.
So this is a question for both of you, and I think we have time for about one more question, so maybe we'll end on this note. But several people have wanted to know what you're reading now, what's impressed you, and what, especially over these past 3 months, you both have enjoyed reading.
Do you want to go first, Michelle?
The only thing I've really read recently was the free ebook about defunding the police. Beyond that, and rereading this book, what have I been reading lately? I always blank out when I ask these questions.
Well, I'll go first, and then if you think of more, you can speak out.
Yeah.
So let's see, I read a first novel, actually not that recently, but I'm going to mention it because it's so good, called Kingdom Tide by Ry Curtis. It's really superb. It's one of the best first novels I've ever read. So I love that. I'm reading The Mirror and the Light, Hilary Mantel. She's absolutely spectacular. I recently read Another Brooklyn, which I had never read, by Jacqueline Woodson, which is a really beautiful book, very fragmented, but also really full, and very, very short, but full of a lot of feeling, and very much about sort of girlhood in Brooklyn. Let's see. I'm usually reading old stuff as well. So right now I'm reading Dawn Powell's book, A Time to Be Born, which was published in 42, which I'm really enjoying. It's sort of a comedy satire. And let's see, what else? I think I'm going to pause there. And Michelle, if you have anything to add, please do.
Yeah, I've recently read MFK Fisher's Gastronomical Me, and I reread Hemingway's Movable Feast, and both of them made me miss dining out and traveling so very much. I really enjoyed Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and I also reread one of my favorite books of all time, Richard Ford's Rock Springs. And one of the things that I actually felt I learned hugely from writing Crying in H Mart was one thing that Robin Desser said to me was, well, how did they look at each other? And that to me was just such a shocking, simple question of just how important it is when characters look at each other, and also describing the weather. And it seemed like such a basic thing to like even write that sentence out, but then rereading one of my favorite books and just underlining and rewriting all of the parts where Richard Ford just talks about the weather or the way that characters look at each other was really helpful for me to just like wrap my head around just how simple it can be and how essential it is in the movement of two characters interacting with one another, is describing just how they look at one another.
Well, I feel like that seems like a perfect note for us to end on. Thank you both so much. This has been
such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Speak.
Thank you all
and to know that you're working on something new, Jenny, that sounds incredibly exciting. I can't wait to read it. Thanks to all of you out there for joining us for the How Have I Not Read This Book Club. Because you're here with us now, you get to learn about our next selection before the rest of the world does. We are thrilled to announce that we'll be reading Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's best-selling novel, Half of a Yellow Sun. We hope you'll join us for a live virtual discussion on July 16th with Chimamanda herself, in conversation with novelist Essie Adujan. Our partner for this event was Greenlight Books. If you haven't purchased your copy of Goon Squad, please buy one from them now. And our book-selling partner for Chimamanda's book will be Changing Hands Bookstore. So we hope you'll order a copy from Changing Hands and read along with us at #HowHaveINotReadThis. So thank you all again so much.